When Al-Mu'izz lifts a chained slave girl from a stinking market straight to Egypt's throne, every caress turns into a killing, and you will watch whom she strangles for her crown. In the stifling, fly-blown markets of the Levant, amidst the cacophony of haggling merchants and the clanking of iron fetters, destiny often wears the guise of tragedy, and it was here in the early 13th century that a saga of blood and brilliance began. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, camel dung, and the metallic tang of fear, a place where human souls were weighed against silver dirhams and found wanting. Among the huddled masses of the captured and the condemned stood a young woman of Turkic origin, her spirit unbroken despite the chains that bound her wrists, her eyes scanning the horizon not with the despair of a victim but with the calculating gaze of a predator waiting for the cage to open. She was known as Shajar al-Dur, a name that translates to Tree of Pearls, a cruel irony for one draped in rags and dust, yet it was a prophecy whispered by fate itself. In this wretched pit of commerce, where beauty was a curse and strength a liability, the divine attribute of Al-Mu'izz, the bestower of honors, began its silent work, preparing to elevate the lowest of the low to a height that would dizzy the kings of the earth. She was not merely a body to be sold, she was a vessel of potential catastrophe and magnificence, waiting for the right hand to unlock the terrifying power coiled within her. When the Princess Salih Ayyub, the future Sultan of Egypt, cast his eyes upon her, he saw not a servant to warm his bed but a mind sharp enough to cut glass and a will forged in the cold fires of adversity. He purchased her for a sum that would soon seem laughably small compared to the empire she would one day command, and in that transaction, the world shifted on its axis without a single soul noticing the tremor. She was swept away from the squalor of the market to the gilded cages of the harem, a place of silk cushions and poisoned whispers, where 1,000 women vied for the attention of one man, and where a single misstep meant a silent disappearance into the dark waters of the Nile. But Shajar al-Dur was no ordinary concubine content with trinkets and sweetmeats. She studied the intricate, deadly game of court politics with the intensity of a scholar and the ruthlessness of a general. She bore the Sultan a son, Khalil, and with that blood connection, she shattered the glass ceiling of her station, transitioning from property to a free woman, yet she knew that true freedom in a world of men was an illusion maintained only by superior force. As she rose through the ranks, whispering counsel into the ear of the Sultan that proved wiser than that of his bearded viziers, the manifestation of Al-Mu'izz became undeniable. The girl who had once been inspected like livestock now held the seal of the state in her delicate hands, her voice commanding armies and directing the flow of vast wealth. It was a transformation so absolute, so shocking in its defiance of the natural hierarchy, that it felt supernatural, as if the Almighty had reached down into the mud to shape a golem of pure ambition. Yet, as she stood on the precipice of absolute power, looking down at the bowing heads of those who would have once ignored her existence, a dark truth began to fester in her heart. The bestower of honors gives, but the weight of that honor is heavy enough to crush the soul, and in the shadows of the palace, where torchlight danced on walls of stone, Shajar al-Dur began to realize that the only way to keep the honor she had been given was to become something monstrous, something that would make even the hardened soldiers of the Mamluk Guard tremble in their sleep. The ascent was complete, but the summit was a lonely, wind-swept peak where the air was too thin to breathe, and the only way down was a fall that would shatter the world. The year 1249 brought with it a storm of iron and fanaticism that threatened to drown the Nile Delta in Christian blood, as the Seventh Crusade, led by the pious and formidable King Louis IX of France, landed upon the shores of Damietta like a plague of locusts sent by a vengeful god. The Frankish Armada darkened the horizon, a floating city of timber and steel, carrying thousands of knights who hungered for the conquest of Cairo and the destruction of the Saracen power. But while the invaders sharpened their swords and filled the air with their foreign hymns, a far more insidious enemy was devouring the Sultanate from within, for as Salih Ayyub, the Lion of Egypt and the only man standing between the Islamic world and annihilation, was rotting alive in his tent at Al-Mansurah. A great abscess had consumed his leg, the gangrene creeping up his limb with the inexorable slowness of a ticking clock, turning the air inside the royal pavilion thick with the cloying, sweet stench of decaying flesh that no amount of burning incense or rosewater could mask. The camp was a powder keg of anxiety, the soldiers whispering that their leader was too weak to mount a horse, and in the medieval world, a king who could not ride was a king who could not rule. It was in this suffocating atmosphere of impending doom that Shahjar al-Dur ceased to be a mere consort and became the architect of history, standing vigil over a dying man while the wolves gathered at the gate. When the Sultan finally breathed his last, his lungs rattling with the fluid of death, the silence that fell over the tent was heavier than the pyramids, for his death at such a critical juncture was not just a tragedy but a death sentence for the entire army. If the Mamluks knew their master was gone, panic would shatter their ranks, and Egypt would fall before the sun set. Shahjar al-Dur looked upon the cooling corpse of her husband and made a decision that defied every law of nature and governance, a choice so cold and calculating that it freezes the blood to consider it. She decided that the Sultan was not dead, not so long as she possessed the will to keep his ghost alive. She summoned the commander of the army and the chief eunuch, the only two souls she trusted to hold the weight of this treasonous secret, and swore them to a silence that would cost them their heads if broken. With a steady hand that betrayed no grief, she ordered the body to be washed and wrapped in secret, but there was to be no funeral, no wailing, and no prayer for the dead. Instead, the Sultan was merely resting, recovering from his ailments, and his orders would continue to flow from the tent as if scribed by his own hand. Shahjar al-Dur became the voice of the dead, forging his signature with a terrifying precision on official decrees, commanding the movement of troops and the distribution of coin, effectively puppeteering a corpse to lead a war against the most powerful monarch of Europe. Every day, servants brought trays of roasted meats and delicacies to the royal tent, and every day those trays returned empty, the food disposed of in secret to maintain the illusion of a ravenous, recovering ruler, while inside, the only thing eating was the secret that grew larger with every passing hour. The deception held the army together by the sheer force of her will, buying precious time as the Crusaders advanced toward Al-Mansurah, drunk on their initial victories and the perceived passivity of the Egyptian forces. The French knights, led by the reckless Count Robert of Artois, the king's brother, charged into the narrow, winding streets of the city, expecting to trample a disorganized rabble, but they found themselves walking into a slaughterhouse designed by the mind of a woman they did not even know existed. The Mamluk forces, the Bari regiment with their lions of war like Baibars and Qutuz, sprang the trap, turning the city into a cauldron of death where heavy European cavalry could not maneuver, and the streets ran slick with the blood of the nobility of France. From the shadows, Shahjar al-Dur watched as the bestower of honors, Al-Mu'izz, shifted the scales of fate, stripping the glory from the Crusaders and draping it across the shoulders of a former slave. The victory was absolute, a crushing humiliation that culminated not just in the defeat of the army but in the capture of King Louis himself, the saintly monarch shackled and held for ransom, his life spared only by the mercy of the woman who had outwitted him. It was a moment of supreme irony and shock, for the Christian king, who had come to liberate the Holy Land, found himself a prisoner of a heathen state secretly ruled by a woman, a reality that would have shattered his worldview had he known the truth. The ghost of the Sultan had won the war, but the spirit of the victory belonged entirely to the Tree of Pearls, who had turned a corpse into a shield and a lie into a legend, securing her place as the true power behind the veil, yet setting the stage for a conflict that would demand a price in blood far higher than she had yet paid. With the Crusader king in chains and the French army shattered, the euphoria of victory swept through the streets of Cairo like a fever, intoxicating the populace and blinding them to the unnatural precipice upon which their government balanced. The deception of the dead Sultan could not be maintained forever, and when the shroud was finally lifted, the truth did not bring collapse, but rather a terrifying new dawn. The heir, Turan Shah, had arrived only to alienate the very Mamluks who had saved his kingdom, his arrogance a fatal flaw in a court of wolves, and his swift, brutal assassination at the hands of the Bari regiment left a vacuum that sucked the very air out of the room. Into this void stepped Shahjar al-Dur, no longer the weeping widow or the secret hand behind the curtain, but the Sultana of Egypt in the blazing light of day. For 80 glorious days, the unthinkable became reality, the Friday sermons, the khutbah, which had for centuries praised only bearded caliphs and sultans, now echoed with her name from the minarets of every mosque from Alexandria to the Upper Nile. Coins were struck in the mints of Cairo, heavy gold dinars and silver dirhams bearing the inscription Malikat al-Muslimin, the Queen of the Muslims, and Walidat al-Khalil, the Mother of Khalil, grounding her legitimacy in the flesh of her son and the iron of her will. She sat upon the throne not as a regent, but as a monarch, signing decrees with the flourish of a ruler ordained by God, her signature, Walidat Khalil, becoming the law of the land. It was a dizzying ascent, a direct challenge to the patriarchal bedrock of the medieval Islamic world, a moment where the impossible seemed to have been willed into existence by the sheer force of her competency. She had saved Islam from the Crusaders, she reasoned, surely, she had earned the right to lead it. But the bestower of honors, Al-Mu'izz, grants power only to test the spirit, and the test that arrived came not from the swords of infidels but from the quill of the faithful. Far to the east, in the fabled city of Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliph, the spiritual leader of all Sunni Muslims, looked upon the reports from Egypt with revulsion. To him, the idea of a woman sitting on the throne of Saladin was an abomination, a subversion of the divine order that threatened to invite chaos upon the Ummah. He dipped his pen in ink blacker than a starless night and composed a missive that would strike Shajar al-Dur with more force than a trebuchet stone. The letter arrived in Cairo, carried by a messenger who dared not meet the Sultana's eyes, and its words were read aloud in a court that suddenly grew cold and silent. "If you have no men left in Egypt," the Caliph wrote with dripping sarcasm, "let us know, and we will send you some." It was a devastating humiliation, a public declaration that her victory, her competence, and her salvation of the realm meant nothing before the single fact of her gender. The Mamluk emirs, those hardened warriors who had slaughtered the French knights, shifted uncomfortably in their silks. They respected her, they feared her, but they could not defy the Caliph. The legitimacy of the state hung by a thread, and without the blessing of Baghdad, Egypt would be a pariah, vulnerable to rebellion and invasion. The Queen of Muslims realized with a sinking heart that she had hit a ceiling made not of glass, but of stone, and to shatter it would bring the roof down upon her own head. Survival demanded adaptation, and Shajar al-Dur was nothing if not a survivor. She knew she had to step down from the throne to save her power, a paradox that only a master of intrigue could navigate. She needed a husband, a man to wear the turban and hold the scepter, a veil behind which she could continue to rule. She did not cast her gaze upon the lions of the army, the fierce Baibars or the ambitious Qutuz, for such men were too strong, too willful to be controlled. Instead, her eyes settled on Izz al-Din Aibak, a Mamluk of mid-ranking status, a man known for his mediocrity rather than his brilliance, a soldier who was solid, dependable, and, she believed, utterly pliable. He was the perfect screen, a blank canvas upon which she could project her authority. The wedding was a grand affair, a spectacle of pomp and circumstance designed to reassure the masses and the Caliph that order had been restored, that a man was once again at the helm. Aibak was proclaimed Sultan, his name read in the prayers and stamped on the coins, but from the moment the nuptial contract was signed, it was clear who held the true dominion. Shajar al-Dur did not retreat to the harem to weave tapestries, she devoured the state. She retained the keys to the treasury, the lifeblood of the empire, ensuring that not a single dirham was spent without her consent. She commanded the loyalty of the Bahri Mamluks, her late husband's personal guard, who looked at Aibak with thinly veiled contempt and at her with adoration. The new sultan found himself a ruler in title alone, a guest in his own palace, barred from the secrets of statecraft and treated with the polite condescension reserved for a dull child. When Aibak attempted to assert his authority, to speak on matters of war or diplomacy, he was met with a wall of silence or a sharp, correcting glance from his wife that cut deeper than a knife. She dictated the letters he signed, she appointed the ministers who bowed to him, she decided when the armies marched and when they slept. To ensure his total isolation, she forbade him from seeing his former wife and his son, Ali, locking them away in a separate residence, denying him the comfort of his own family and forcing him to exist solely within her orbit. The atmosphere in the citadel of Cairo curdled, transforming from a court of victory into a domestic prison of suffocating tension. Aibak, the man elevated by marriage to the highest office in the land, realized he was little more than a atabeg, a guardian, a glorified servant to the woman who shared his bed but not her power. The humiliation festered in his gut, a slow-burning poison fueled by the whispers of his own circle, who mocked him as the Sultan of the Veil. He was the ruler of Egypt, yet he had to ask his wife for pocket money. He was the commander of the faithful's deputy, yet he could not issue an order that she did not vet. Shajar al-Durr, blinded by her own brilliance and the intoxication of absolute control, failed to see that a puppet with a heart can still feel rage, and that a man stripped of his dignity is a dangerous animal. She walked the halls of the citadel with the stride of a titan, convinced that she had solved the riddle of her existence, that she had cheated the system by placing a mask over the face of power. But in the dim, flickering light of the torches, the eyes of his al-Din Ibak began to change, shifting from the vacuous look of a subordinate to the cold, hard stare of a man plotting his escape from the strings that danced him. The bestower of honors had raised them both, but the house they built together was constructed on a foundation of resentment, and the mortar was beginning to crack. The year 1257 dawned with a tension that lay heavy upon the humid air of Cairo, a suffocating blanket of suspicion that turned every shadow into an assassin and every whisper into a conspiracy. The fragile truce between the Pearl of Egypt and her puppet husband had corroded into open hostility, a cold war fought within the gilded walls of the citadel where silence was often more deadly than a scream. Is al-Din Ibak, the man Shajar al-Durr had plucked from the ranks of the soldiery and dressed in the robes of a sultan, had grown weary of his strings. The taste of power, even the diluted draught he was permitted to sip, had emboldened him, and the whispers of his sycophants, men who loathed being ruled by a woman, had finally taken root in his heart. They told him he was the lion of the faith, the successor of Saladin, and that it was a stain upon his honor to be leashed by a bondswoman who had outlived her usefulness. Ibak, driven by a dangerous mixture of insecurity and ambition, made a move that was not merely an act of defiance but a declaration of war. He sent secret emissaries to the north, to the ancient city of Mosul, to negotiate a marriage alliance with the daughter of Badr al-Din Lu'lu. It was a calculated insult, a political masterstroke designed to replace the aging, domineering Shajar al-Durr with a younger princess of noble blood, a woman who would bear him legitimate heirs and grant him the dynastic prestige he so desperately craved. To add salt to the wound, rumors began to circulate that he intended to bring his new bride to the very citadel where Shajar al-Durr resided, forcing the woman who had saved Egypt from the Crusaders to watch her replacement ascend the steps of the throne she had built. When the intelligence of this betrayal reached the ears of Shajar al-Durr, it did not elicit tears or the wailing of a scorned lover, for her heart had long since hardened into a diamond, impervious to sentimental injury. Instead, it ignited a cold, terrifying clarity. She understood immediately that this was not a matter of romantic jealousy, though the insult to her pride was sharp enough to draw blood, but a matter of existential survival. In the brutal calculus of Mamluk politics, a deposed queen does not retire to a countryside villa, she is silenced, exiled, or strangled in the night to prevent her from becoming a rallying point for dissent. The proposal to the Princess of Mosul was her death warrant, signed in invisible ink. The bestower of honors, Al-Mu'izz, had raised her high, but she realized with a jolt of adrenaline that he would not save her now, she had to save herself. She spent days locked in her chambers, pacing the marble floors like a caged tigress, her mind racing through the labyrinth of possibilities until only one path remained open. Ibak had to die. Not in a month, not in a week, but before the envoys could return from Mosul with the marriage contract. It had to be done intimately, within the sphere of her control, where she could manage the narrative before the news reached the barracks of the Mu'izzi Mamluks who might rise to avenge him. The trap she laid was baited with the sweetest of poisons, submission. Shajar al-Durr composed a letter to her estranged husband, a masterpiece of deceit written with the ink of humility. She claimed to have seen the error of her ways, to have accepted her fate as a dutiful wife, and invited him to the citadel to reconcile, to share her bed one last time and discuss the terms of the new arrangement peacefully. It was a performance worthy of the greatest storytellers of the Orient. Ibak, blinded by his own vanity and the belief that he had finally broken her spirit, walked willingly into the lion's den. His advisers, men with sharper instincts who smelled the metallic scent of a trap, begged him not to go, warning him that the tree of pearls was never more dangerous than when she bent in the wind. But Ibak laughed them off, confident that his impending alliance with Mosul had rendered him untouchable. On the fatal day, the 10th of April in the year 1257, he rode up the winding path to the citadel, leaving his guards at the gate, stripping himself of his armor and his caution as he entered the private quarters of the queen. The atmosphere within the palace was eerily quiet, the usual bustle of servants absent, replaced by a heavy, pregnant silence that pressed against the eardrums. Shajar al-Dur received him with a smile that did not reach her eyes, her face a mask of porcelain perfection. She spoke soft words, lulling him into a false sense of security, offering him sweetmeats and sherbet, playing the role of the repentant wife to perfection. As the evening wore on, she suggested he retire to the hammam, the royal bathhouse, to wash away the dust of the city and the cares of the state before they retired for the night. The bathhouse was a marvel of architecture, a sanctuary of marble and steam where light filtered through colored glass stars in the domed ceiling, casting blood-red and bruise-purple shadows on the wet stones. The air was thick with the scent of ambergris and burning aloe wood, a heavy, intoxicating fog designed to relax the limbs and dull the senses. Ibak entered the steam room, stripping away his robes until he stood naked and vulnerable, surrendering his body to the heat, closing his eyes as the steam opened his pores, unaware that he had just stepped into his own tomb. It was then that the trap snapped shut. Shajar al-Dur had not come alone, she had bribed 5 of her most loyal eunuchs, strong men with hands like iron vices who owed their lives and fortunes solely to her. They had been waiting in the alcoves, hidden by the steam and the shadows, breathless and trembling with the enormity of the regicide they were about to commit. At a signal, perhaps a dropped comb, or a sudden change in the rhythm of the water, they emerged from the gloom like demons summoned from the underworld. Muzzin al-Jukander, the leader of the conspirators, struck first. There was no dignity in the attack, no clash of swords or noble exchange of words. It was a brutal, frantic scuffle of wet skin against wet skin, a chaos of slipping limbs and muffled grunts. Ibak, realizing too late the depth of his folly, tried to fight back, shouting for help, but the thick stone walls of the hammam swallowed his cries, and the steam choked his voice. The struggle was visceral and horrifyingly intimate. One of the eunuchs seized the Sultan by his testicles, twisting with a cruelty that brought the mighty warrior to his knees in a spasm of agony, while another clamped a hand over his mouth to stifle his screams. They did not use knives, for fear of the blood leaving too much evidence or perhaps to make it look like a fall, but the violence was no less lethal. They dragged him to the corner of the bathing room, where the water flowed into the drains, and there, amidst the soap suds and the swirling steam, they fell upon him in a frenzy. Shajar al-Dur, standing just beyond the threshold or perhaps watching from the shadows of the changing room, listened to the wet thuds of fists against flesh, the cracking of cartilage, and the desperate, gurgling gasps of the man she had made a king. It is said that in his final moments, Ibak managed to lock eyes with one of his attackers or perhaps caught a glimpse of his wife's silhouette, his expression shifting from terror to a profound, heartbreaking betrayal. The eunuchs, fueled by the adrenaline of fear, for if they failed, they would surely be flayed alive, twisted his neck with a sickening snap, or as some chroniclers claim, smothered him with the heavy, wet towels used for drying, pressing the fabric into his face until the thrashing ceased. When the deed was done, the silence that returned to the bathhouse was louder than the screams had been. The steam continued to rise, indifferent to the murder, curling around the cooling body of his al-Din Ibak, who lay twisted on the marble floor like a discarded puppet, his eyes staring sightlessly at the domed ceiling. Shajar al-Dur stepped into the room, her slippers making no sound on the wet stones. She looked down at the corpse, her chest heaving, the adrenaline crashing into a wave of nausea and realization. The deed was irrevocable. The line had been crossed. She had preserved her dignity, she had stopped the marriage to the princess of Mosul, but at a price that would demand immediate payment. The water in the runnels turned pink, not from a stab wound, but from the blood that had burst from his nose and mouth during the struggle. She ordered the body to be washed, to be laid out in his bed as if he had died in his sleep, a sudden stopping of the heart, a natural tragedy. But as she looked at the bruises blooming on his throat and the terror etched into his rigor mortis grin, she knew that this was a lie no one would believe. The sheer physicality of the murder, the brutality required to extinguish the life of a healthy soldier with bare hands, left marks that could not be washed away with rosewater. The rest of the night was a blur of frantic activity and encroaching dread. Shajar al-Dur, usually the master of foresight, found herself paralyzed by the immediate horror of the corpse in the other room. She sent for a doctor, intending to bribe him to certify a natural death, but the reality of the situation began to dawn on her as the sun threatened to rise. The palace was waking up. The guards would soon change. The Mamluks of Ibak, the Mu'izzi regiment, would demand to see their master. She had killed the puppet to save the strings, but she had forgotten that the puppet was beloved by the wolves who guarded the gates. As she sat by the lifeless body of her husband, rearranging the sheets to hide the violence of his end, the bestower of honor seemed to mock her from the shadows. She had taken the ultimate honor, the power over life and death, into her own hands, and in doing so, she had initiated a countdown to her own destruction. The morning light that crept through the lattice windows did not bring warmth, it brought a cold, harsh illumination upon a woman who was no longer a queen, but a murderer trapped in a tower with the evidence of her crime, waiting for the inevitable pounding on the door that would signal the end of her reign and the beginning of her torment. The bathhouse, once a place of cleansing, now smelled of death, a scent that would cling to Shajar al-Dur's skin for the few, short terrifying days she had left to live. The dawn of the 11th day of April in the year 1257 did not break with the promise of a new day, but rather with the sickly, grey pallor of a shroud, casting a mournful light over the citadel of the mountain where the air was still heavy with the metallic tang of murder. Shajar al-Dur, the woman who had defied empires and brought kings to their knees, now found herself standing amidst the wreckage of her own ambition, the silence of the palace amplification of the screaming panic that began to uncoil within her chest. She had thought the death of Izz al-Din Ibak would act as a cauterization, a burning away of the rot that threatened her rule, but instead, it had opened a wound so deep and profuse that the blood of the state was draining away with terrifying speed. The plan, hatched in the fevered desperation of the night, was to present the Sultan's death as a sudden, tragic stroke of fate, a bilious attack or a stopping of the heart during the night, a lie she attempted to sell with the frantic energy of a merchant peddling broken wares. She sent for the physician, a man whose hands trembled as he approached the royal bedchamber, and she summoned the grandees of the realm, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the hollow terror of a gambler who has wagered their very soul and lost. But the dead speak a language that no living tongue can silence, and the corpse of Ibak was a testament to violence that no amount of rosewater or linen could hide. When the emirs of the Mu'izzi regiment, the loyal bond brothers of the slain sultan, arrived at the citadel, they did not find a man at peace, they found a battered husk, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, his face mottled with the purple bruising of suffocation, and the telltale marks of a desperate struggle etched into his skin. The lie evaporated instantly, incinerated by the fury of men who saw not a tragedy, but an assassination, and the grief of the soldiers transformed within a single heartbeat into a feral, baying hunger for vengeance. The citadel, usually a fortress of order, descended into a pandemonium that threatened to tear the very stones apart. The Mu'izzi Mamluks, led by the ferocious Qutuz, surrounded the royal quarters, their swords drawn, their shouts echoing off the high stone walls, demanding the head of the murderess. "Where is the woman who slays her masters?" they roared, their loyalty to their fallen comrade overriding any reverence they once held for the Pearl of Egypt. Shajar al-Dur, trapped in the upper chambers, could hear the clamor rising like a flood, the sound of boots on stone, the clashing of steel, and the terrifying thuds of bodies being thrown against the heavy wooden doors. She turned to her own guard, the Bari Mamluks, the men she had nurtured and protected, looking for the steel in their eyes that had once saved her from the French. But what she found was hesitation. Even the Bari, men who had waded through blood at her command, recoiled at the intimacy and dishonor of the crime. To kill a sultan on the battlefield was war, but to strangle him in his bath was a treachery that stained all who touched it. They defended her, yes, but with the reluctance of men holding back a tide they knew was inevitable, their swords raised not in defiance, but in a grim, dutiful delay of the executioner. In a frantic attempt to regain control, to spin the wheel of fortune one last time, Shajar al-Dur tried to buy the loyalty she could no longer command. She sent messengers scuttling through the secret passages, carrying offers of the throne to the most powerful emirs, promising them her hand in marriage, the keys to the treasury, the very kingdom itself if they would only stand by her and validate her deed. She offered the signet ring to the emir Is al-Din Ademir, and when he refused, trembling at the toxicity of her touch, she offered it to another, and another. But the bestower of honors, al-Mu'izz, had turned his face away, and she found that she was radioactive. No man wanted a crown that dripped with the blood of his predecessor, and no man wanted a wife who kept a squad of stranglers in her bathhouse. The rejection was absolute and humiliating. The power she had wielded so effortlessly, the influence that had seemed as solid as the pyramids, crumbled into dust between her fingers. She was no longer the queen of Muslims, she was a pariah, a cornered animal, a woman alone in a room full of men who wanted her dead. With the Mu'izzi Mamluks battering down the defenses and her own support evaporating like morning mist, Shajar al-Dur retreated to the Red Tower, the highest and most fortified point of the citadel, locking herself in with a handful of servants who were too terrified to flee. It was here, in the suffocating isolation of the tower, that the final, most chilling transformation took place. The fear that had gripped her in the morning burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard slag of pure spite. She realized with a clarity that borders on madness that her end was not a possibility, but a certainty. She would not live to see another sunrise, or if she did, it would be through the bars of a dungeon or from the height of a gibbet. The realization liberated her from the constraints of hope. If she was to fall, she decided, she would leave nothing behind for the vultures who circled her corpse. She would not be the prize to be divided, she would be the fire that scorched the earth. She turned her gaze to her jewelry boxes, the vast, accumulated wealth of a lifetime spent at the pinnacle of the Islamic world. There were pearls the size of pigeon eggs, the very namesakes of her existence, shimmering with the luster of the moon. There were rubies as red as the blood she had spilled, emeralds the color of the Nile and flood, and diamonds that captured the light of the torches and threw it back with a cold, unyielding brilliance. These were not just trinkets, they were the currency of her power, the physical manifestation of her dignity, the gifts of sultans and the tribute of kings. And she would not let another woman wear them. She would not let the new wife of Ibak, or the concubines of the Mamluks, drape her glory around their necks. Shajar al-Dur called for a mortar and pestle, heavy implements of stone and brass usually reserved for grinding spices or medicine. With a manic, terrifying focus, she began to feed her treasures into the bowl. She took a necklace of pearls, a strand worth a king's ransom, and smashed the heavy pestle down upon it. Crack! The sound was sharp, sickening, like the breaking of small bones. She ground and ground, the sweat beading on her forehead, her breath coming in ragged gasps, until the lustrous spheres were reduced to a fine, worthless white powder. She threw in the emeralds, swinging the pestle with the strength of a woman possessed, shattering the crystal structures, turning the gems into jagged shards and then into green dust. The diamonds were harder, resisting her fury, but she struck them again and again, chipping them, flawed them, ruining their facets until they were nothing but dull, crushed glass. For hours, the only sound in the Red Tower was the rhythmic, grinding crunch of destruction. The servants watched in horrified silence, huddled in the corners, witnessing a ritual of self-immolation that was far more terrifying than any weeping. She did not stop until her hands were blistered and raw, until the floor around her was coated in a glittering, worthless sand of rainbow dust. She took the powder, this fortune of millions of dinars, and mixed it into bowls of water, churning it into a gritty sludge, or cast it out the high windows into the wind, watching the dust of her legacy blow away over the rooftops of Cairo, lost forever to the muck of the streets. Let them have the dust, she might have whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Let them inherit the wind. It was an act of supreme ego, a final assertion that she, Shajar al-Dur, was the creator and the destroyer of her own worth, and that without her, the trappings of her royalty were meaningless. When the grinding was done, she turned her attention to the royal treasury certificates, the deeds to lands, the records of debts owed to the crown. She tore them into confetti, she burned them in the braziers, erasing the bureaucratic memory of her reign. She destroyed the state from within the room, leaving a chaotic administrative void for her successors. It was the tantrum of a god stripping the world of its magic before departing. She sat amidst the debris of her wealth, her hands grey with the dust of diamonds, her hair disheveled, her eyes burning with a terrifying vacancy. She was empty now. The fear was gone, the ambition was gone, the hope was gone. There was only the void, and the waiting. Below, the doors to the Red Tower shuddered under the blows of the battering ram. The wood splintered, the iron hinges groaned, and the shouts of the soldiers grew louder, a crescendo of violence coming to claim its due. Shajar al-Dur did not move. She sat on her divan, upright, regal, covered in the dust of her own destruction, a statue of tragedy carved from the living flesh. She had been the tree of pearls, a thing of beauty and value, but she had ground herself down to the root, ensuring that when they finally broke through, they would find no treasure, no queen, only a woman who had already destroyed everything that mattered before they could touch a single hair on her head. The bestower of honors had given her the world, and in her final act of defiance, she had decided to break it rather than hand it back. The door gave way with a deafening crash, and the wolves poured in, their swords hungry, but the woman who met their gaze was already a ghost, haunting the ruins of a life that was 1,000 times more vibrant, and 1,000 times more deadly, than any of them could ever comprehend. The sun had barely begun its ascent over the Mokattam hills when the heavy oak doors of the Red Tower were finally breached, splintering inward under the relentless assault of iron-shod rams and the fury of betrayed men. The dust of the pulverized jewels still hung in the air, a glittering, choking mist that coated the throat and stung the eyes, but for the soldiers of the Mu'izzi regiment who stormed the chamber, the sight that greeted them was far more jarring than the destruction of mere wealth. They found Shajar al-Dur, the woman who had commanded the armies of Islam and broken the back of the crusade, sitting in absolute stillness amidst the ruin of her fortune, her hands grey with diamond dust, her face a mask of terrifying, unnatural calm. There were no tears, no pleas for mercy, no hysterical bargaining for a life that was already forfeit. She looked upon the drawn swords and the snarling faces of the Mamluks, men like Qutuz and Baibars, who had once kissed the hem of her robe, with a gaze that was both imperious and distant, as if she were watching the events from a great height, detached from the flesh that was about to be torn asunder. For a moment, the sheer weight of her presence held the violence at bay, the soldiers hesitated, their blades wavering, paralyzed by the residual aura of the sovereignty she had worn so naturally. It was a final, fleeting victory of the spirit, a silent assertion that though they could take her life, they could not take the dignity she had refused to surrender. But the spell was broken by the shout of an officer, a reminder of the corpse cooling in the bathhouse below, and the rough hands of the guard seized her, stripping her of her outer robes, binding her wrists with cords of rough hemp that bit into the skin, dragging the queen of Muslims from her high tower down into the bowels of the citadel she had ruled. She was not granted the mercy of a swift execution, for the politics of the interregnum demanded a theater of legality to cover the nakedness of the coup. The teenage son of Ibak, a boy named Ali, whom Shajar al-Dur had kept separated from his father, locked away in obscurity, was raised to the Sultanate amidst the clashing of shields and the roar of the crowd. He was but a child, a figurehead, but his mother, the former wife of Ibak, was a woman scorned, a vessel of concentrated hatred who had waited in the shadows for years, nursing the coals of her jealousy until they burned white-hot. Her name was Amali, and she did not want Shajar al-Dur dead by the sword of a soldier. Such an end was too noble, too clean, too masculine. She demanded the prisoner for herself. The negotiations were brief and brutal. The Mamluks, eager to wash their hands of the regicide and fearful of the public outcry if they were seen butchering the widow of As-Salih Ayyub, agreed to hand her over to the women of the harem. It was a sentence worse than death, a condemnation to a domestic hell where the laws of war did not apply, and where cruelty was intimate, personal, and fueled by a vendetta that transcended the political. Shahjar al-Dur was transferred from the dungeon to the residence of Amali, dragged through the corridors of the harem where she had once walked as a goddess, now jeered at by the very concubines and servants who had scrambled to serve her sherbet and fan her brow. The room in which the final act of this tragedy played out was suffocatingly hot, the air thick with the scent of musk and the sour tang of unwashed bodies, for the women of the household had gathered like a murder of crows, their eyes bright with the anticipation of violence. Shahjar al-Dur was thrown to the floor, the marble hard and unforgiving against her knees. She looked up to see Ali seated upon a divan, her face twisted in a rictus of triumphant malice. There were no words of judgment spoken, no reading of crimes, for the guilt was assumed and the sentence was preordained. The mother of Ali simply nodded, a small, sharp gesture that unleashed the storm. The bond-maids, the servants, the slaves, women who wore on their feet the heavy, wooden bath clogs known as kabakib, surrounded the fallen queen. These were not warriors trained in the art of killing, they were a mob, and their weapon was the instrument of their daily servitude. They slipped the wooden clogs from their feet, holding them like bludgeons, the hardwood dense and heavy. The first blow struck Shahjar al-Dur on the shoulder, a dull, cracking thud that shattered the clavicle and elicited a sharp intake of breath but no scream. Then the rain began. A torrent of wood against flesh, a chaotic, rhythmic drumming of hatred. They beat her with a savagery that defied comprehension, the kabakib rising and falling in a blur of motion. They struck her head, her back, her face, the heavy heels of the clogs tearing the skin, breaking the nose, fracturing the ribs. It was a chaotic, messy slaughter, fueled by the hysteria of the mob, each woman trying to land a blow to prove her loyalty to the new mistress, to exorcise the fear of the old one. Shahjar al-Dur, the woman who had outwitted the king of France and ruled the Nile, curled into a ball, trying to protect her head with her arms, but the blows were relentless, a hailstorm of wood that pulverized the bones of her hands. The sound in the room was a cacophony of grunts, the slap of wood on wet meat, and the sickening crunch of cartilage giving way. There was no dignity in it, no moment of final words, it was a reduction of a human being to a bloody heap of rags and flesh, a brutal erasure of the self under the heels of the shoes she had once been too high to even look upon. The irony was absolute, the woman who had killed her husband in a bath was beaten to death with the implements of the bath, destroyed by the very symbols of the domestic sphere she had tried to transcend. When the movement finally stopped, when the last arm grew tired and the only sound was the heavy breathing of the exhausted women, Shahjar al-Dur lay still. She was unrecognizable, her face a ruin, her body a broken sack of bones, the pearl crushed back into the dust from which it came. But the malice of Ali was not yet sated. Death was not enough, there must be degradation. She ordered the body to be stripped of its remaining shredded garments, leaving the former sultana naked, a final humiliation in a culture where modesty was the veil of honor. The broken corpse was dragged by the feet through the polished hallways of the citadel, leaving a wide, wet smear of crimson on the stones, down the winding stairs, and out into the blinding light of the courtyard. The soldiers on the wall turned their faces away, unable to watch the desecration of the woman who had led them to glory, but they did not intervene. The body was hoisted up to the parapet and unceremoniously heaved over the edge, tumbling down the sheer stone face of the fortress to land with a wet thud in the dry moat below, a place of refuse and stray dogs. For 3 days and 3 nights, the body of Shahjar al-Dur lay in the ditch, baking in the relentless Egyptian sun, the skin blistering and blackening, the flies gathering in clouds that darkened the air. The street urchins threw stones at it, the wild dogs of Cairo, lean and hungry, tore at the flesh that had once worn the silk of Damascus. It was a spectacle of horror that hushed the city, a grim reminder to every soul who passed by of the terrifying fickleness of fortune. The woman who had saved the Islamic world was now carrion, denied even the basic dignity of a shroud or a hole in the earth. It was said that eventually, someone, perhaps a former servant moved by pity or a pious man fearing the pollution of the city, climbed down into the moat and gathered what little remained of her, a few baskets of bones and tattered flesh, and buried her in a modest tomb near the mausoleum of the Ruqayya. But the lesson had been carved into the psyche of the city. In the end, the story of Shajar al-Dur is not merely a tale of ambition and murder, but a terrifying testament to the attribute of God known as Al-Mu'izz, the bestower of honors, and Al-Mudhil, the abaser. He had reached into the slave market and raised a bondswoman to the throne of the pharaohs, granting her a glory that outshone the stars. But when she forgot that the power was a loan and not a gift, when she sought to hold it with hands stained by the blood of her husband, the hand of the divine turned. The ascent was miraculous, but the fall was absolute. As the wind howls through the dusty streets of Cairo today, whistling past the crumbling stones of the citadel, one can almost hear the clatter of wooden clogs and the whisper of a name that once commanded the world, now just a cautionary ghost story told in the dark, that honor is a heavy robe, and when it is stripped away, it takes the skin with it.